In order for a lobster to grow, it must shed its shell. This is a process called molting, and they do this about once a year throughout their entire life, which means that a lobster will spend much of its time preparing for or in the process of transition. If it grows too old to withstand the grueling process, or if it refuses to molt, it will rot in its shell and die. Every time a lobster molts, their body is regenerated, which means that if it has lost its legs or its claws in the past, somehow it can regrow them. Sometimes lobsters will amputate their own limbs to escape danger, or they may lose them in fights. Before molting, a fully formed new shell called an exoskeleton is produced underneath the existing shell. Nutrients from the old shell are absorbed into the body. And then as blood leaves the appendages, the flesh of the claws shrivels to about a quarter of their normal size to make it easier for them to be withdrawn. And just prior to molting, the lobster absorbs a lot of water, which causes the new shell to swell, eventually pushing away the old one. The lobster will draw its whole body out of the old shell, revealing the new, perfectly formed body. At first, this new shell is soft, and lobsters are vulnerable. Besides, they're completely exhausted by the time they're finished, and they need to give themselves some time to renew their strength. So they hide in caves or stay close to the rock to regain their strength and to protect themselves for about a week or two until their new shell hardens. And what's interesting is they can speed up the process of hardening their new shell if they eat the old shell that they just crawled out of. I read a lot about lobsters in the last couple of days because I was preparing for this sermon and trying to find a good example, a good image to talk about the importance of endings. I've been reading a book called Transitions. I'm just going to show this to you. This is a printout of the cover of the book, Transitions by William Bridges. He's passed away now, but his book has informed me quite a bit about the process of transition. I'm going to switch glasses here. William Bridges has 3 distinct phases that he talks about in his book. The 3 phases is endings, then this neutral zone, which is kind of a confusing rest between phases, and then new beginnings. And so in some cases, the transitions that we go throughout our lives are very similar, have a lot of parallels to the life and the transitions that a lobster will go through. You may never have realized how much in common you have with a lobster. But one of the things that I thought about when I saw the parallels here is that we have, when we are going through our lives, there are phases where something is working really, really well. Our job, our relationship, our family system, whatever it is working really well until it doesn't. And then that's when we, as a process of growth, as a process of evolution in our experience, we discover that something that has been working really good is not working as well anymore. And so we then have to go through that process of casting off the old shell. So before we have a new beginning, there has to be an end. And the end is perhaps the most painful part of this transition process. And so sometimes we try to avoid endings, or we try to rush through them, or we try to deny that they're happening so that we can move through quicker and get to the new beginnings, which always seem to be more exciting and more pleasant than endings. Some transitions that we go through in life are relationships, friendships, different home life changes like moving, or children's school transitions, going from one grade to the next, moving out of the house. Sometimes we have deaths in the family, disability that challenge us, personal changes that we go through, spiritual or religious changes, new understandings about ourselves or about the people around us, things that we hadn't thought of the same way. So we are constantly growing and evolving and changing. And with those things come transitions. Now, there's a difference between changes and transitions. They are not the same thing. A change is goal-driven. It's like there's an end to a relationship, or we move across the country, or move across town, or we leave our job. That is a change. The transition either before, but it is not the change. The transition is internal. Transition is growth driven. It's more about letting go internally of what no longer fits. But now believed or assumed, a shift in your outlook or different attitude towards others. These are things that are internal. So if we are leaving our job, that can happen in a moment, and then comes the transition. Or perhaps the transition is what paved the way for us leaving our job. One example from my life recently is I bought a new mattress. I went out to the store, I bought a mattress, I brought it home. I took the old one out to the trash, put the new one on the bed, put new sheets on it, and there you go. That was a change. Now the transition comes for the next days and weeks when I'm trying to get used to this new mattress, right? I'm sleeping differently, I'm positioning myself differently, I'm feeling different when I wake up in the morning. The transition happens, in this case, after the mattress has been changed. And so that's a very simple kind of way to look at it, but it's an important distinction to make, because many of us will move through life making changes without making transitions, in which case we could bounce from one job to another or from one relationship to another without actually taking the time to figure out why we're bouncing from one place to the next. The transition is the internal focus to figure out why these changes need to be made, why we keep putting ourselves in positions that require continuous change. So taking the time to actually look within and make those transitions is an important process. And it's also important to know that having to go through transition does not imply that there is a personal malfunction or a breakdown. It's normal, it's natural, it's healthy. Like the lobster, if we refuse to go through the transition, we could literally rot in our own shell. William Bridges, in his book, says to become something else, you have to stop being what you are now. To start doing things a new way, you have to end the way you are doing them now. And to develop a new attitude or outlook, you have to let go of the old one you have now. Even though it sounds backwards, endings always come first. The first task is to let go. You may be familiar with the stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross laid out in her book. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These 5 stages you can move through in sequence or completely out of sequence, and you can bounce from one to the next, and then repeat a phase and then go back. There's no textbook way to move through the stages of grief. William Bridges talks about transition and the 5 different types of the 5 different pieces of transition that we can look to. And those are disengagement, dismantling, disidentification, disenchantment, and disorientation. We're going to walk through these very briefly, different facets of transition. But what's interesting to know about this is that you also will not necessarily go through these in order. They're very, very distinct, and sometimes we relive as part of these processes. So grief, the 5 stages of grief, those talk about an emotional journey that you are making through transition and come with them. But transition, these 5 stages are more cognitive. The first one he talks about is disengagement. If you'll remember the story of the lobster, sometimes lobsters will amputate their own limbs or their claws in order to get out of danger, or they'll happen in a fight. So there is a very physical disengagement that happens with a lobster. For us, we are not amputating anything, but we are disengaging. Disengagement can be very sudden. It can be the slam of a door. I'm leaving. I'm out of here. I've had enough. That is a form of disengagement. It can also be very gradual. Disengagement can be the understanding that you're restless, or you're losing interest, or there's a dissatisfaction that permeates your life or the situation, your job, your relationship, the thing from which you are disengaging. It can be a willing or an unwilling disengagement. It could be that your partner is the one who stormed out. That is not your choice. That is something that somebody else did. Maybe you got fired. Maybe you got laid off. That's not a willing disengagement, but it is a disengagement. It is part of the transition process. And it's an important part, because as long as a system is working, it's very difficult for us to imagine our lives differently. And so this disengagement process is a very important part, because it allows us to see new possibilities, to imagine changes that we would never have imagined before. Dismantling is different. While disengagement can be sudden or gradual, dismantling is always gradual. It cannot be sudden, because dismantling is different in that now we're talking about old habits, old behaviors that have to be taken apart one piece at a time. It's not an extraction, a sudden extraction. It is a shift in identity. And so while emotions can accompany dismantling, it's not an emotional process. It is cognitive. While we can feel grief during this process, the dismantling process is the process of going from we to I. This is called the mourning process. And it can be very, very hard, but it is a shift in identity rather than an emotional process. Then we talk about disidentification. Before molting, a new shell is produced under the existing shell for a lobster. The nutrients from the old shell are absorbed into the new shell. And then they start to shrink inside so that the old shell, so it's easier to pull away when it's time to actually molt. The way that we can identify with that is we start losing our old ways of defining ourselves. With disidentification, it's like we have an old shell and we have a new shell developing. And it's kind of the inner side of the disengagement process. It is perhaps the most distressing when it happens at work. Many of us identify ourselves based on what we do. And if we lose the opportunity to be who we are at work, that can be a grueling process. And our old roles and titles that we use to define ourselves, to describe ourselves. When somebody at a party asks, what do you do? And you could have easily said before, I am a teacher, or I'm a pastor, or I'm an airline pilot. That is part of your identity. And when you can't be that anymore, it's like losing that part of you, losing an identity that meant something to you. And so this process can actually be much harder than we imagine it to be, because suddenly you're not quite sure who you are anymore. In many cases, when someone gets a divorce, they have to go through this disidentification process, because we can often identify ourselves in relationship to our spouse. And if we have been in that relationship for a long time, then when that relationship comes to an end, whether willing or unwilling, there is a process of disidentification that has to happen. I am no longer the person that person needs me to be. I'm no longer the person in their life that they come to for these various reasons or these various things. And that can be very, very hard. And it can take a lot of time, part of the transition. And then there's this disenchantment. We all have a reality in our head, something that is the way it is. And that if it isn't the way it is, that it is, then our world is no longer real. Some of these things could be, my husband is faithful. My boss advocates for me. My finances are secure. My children will outlive me. These are things that we have in our head that if they are not so, then my world is not what I think it is. My world is no longer real. It could also be that disenchantment could be that we turn out to be different than we thought we were. We turn out to be a person that we never thought we would be, or that we never thought we were. So many significant transitions begin with this phase of disenchantment. If you discover that your boss doesn't advocate for you, that could be a disenchantment that sets into progress, looking for a different career, looking for a different boss. If you discover that your finances were not as secure as you thought they were, that disenchantment can set off a transition for you. And then the old reality that was in your head, that you are the flawless parent, that you are the ultimate faithful friend, that you are the noble leader or the perfect wife, that starts to crumble. The disenchanted person recognizes the old view was sufficient in its time, but it is not sufficient anymore. One of the most painful parts of a transition that I went through was the transition of going to seminary. I went to seminary so that I could become a spiritual, I wouldn't say I went to seminary to become a pastor, but I wanted to be a preacher, and I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to have influence in the spiritual circles that I held. And I went to seminary and underwent the most grueling spiritual transition that I never expected to go through. And in the process, I lost my faith. The faith that I had held on to so deeply, that was part of my identity, that was part of my mission, my vision for the future, came crumbling down around me. And all of these phases of disengagement, dismantling, disidentification, disenchantment happened when I went to seminary. And I realized that my world, the world that I had in my head, was no longer real. The things that I thought were impenetrable crumbled. And I had then to move through the stages of grief to deal with that disenchantment. And only once I was able to deal with the ending of the way I thought my spirituality was going to be forever, was I able to then grow. And so I had this new shell that was becoming a new part of who I was. And it was making the old shell very uncomfortable. Finally, we talk about disorientation. This is the part of transition where you don't even know who you are. It's like you're lost and you're confused. You get that don't know where I am feeling. And so this deepens as we go through these other parts of transition, this disenchantment and this disidentification. All of these different phases that we go through deepen this disorientation. It's like it's like we're confused, and there's this emptiness that we can't explain. We feel stuck, or we feel dead or lost. And disorientation is a meaningful part of this process. It's an important part of this process, but it doesn't make it fun. When we talk about lobsters, we talk about how they hide in caves and they stay close to the rocks to regain their strength and to protect themselves in this very vulnerable phase of transition. For us, it would be a mistake to try to dismiss this disorientation, try to deny it, try to be strong for the kids, try to be the same, to try to use the same level of being present with your friends as you always were, because this process of this feeling of disorientation can leave you completely drained, without energy. Before we find newness with a new beginning, we have to deal with the nothingness. We can't enjoy the new beginning unless we deal with the ending. And this ending awakens old fears about death and abandonment. These are primal fears in a human, in the way we show up in the world. And endings will often remind us that we are not invincible. So many of us resist this transition because it is not easy. It is really hard. And so all around us, people will see, they'll recognize that we're going through a transition. And so from home or from work, people will encourage you to don't change. We love you just the way you are. Keep on being the old you. Keep showing up in the way that you always have. Unfortunately, when we feel drawn into transition, there are powerful forces that block our way. Sometimes people will take it personally. But you've always loved grandma's pie. What do you mean you're going on a weight loss journey? What do you mean you're not going to eat, cakes and cookies anymore? That's the holidays. And so you feel these pressures from all around you to say, no, don't change. Don't transition. Because people around us, they don't want to see the end come either. William Bridges says, eventually the ways of being that produced and sustained a life phase begin to destroy it. I'd like to repeat that. Eventually, the ways of being that produced and sustained a life phase will begin to destroy it. If we miss the cue that we need to transition from one phase to another, the very thing that has sustained us in the past will begin to destroy it. It will leave us dying inside our old shell in the way that a lobster will rot and die if it refuses to transition out of one shell and into another. The goal of one phase of life, says William Bridges, becomes the burden of the next. So it's important to recognize that the thing that is dying, the thing that is ending, was not necessarily a bad thing. It could have been a healthy thing. It could have been the very thing that has gotten us to where we are now. But it's an important recognition that if we refuse to move on from it, it could be our end. Endings are experiences of dying in many ways. So we should never underestimate the toll that it takes on us. Sometimes endings challenge us so much, challenges our sense of who we are, that we are afraid that endings will be the end of us altogether. But they won't be. They are a necessary part of our life. And I dare to say that in this time of severe trial with COVID-19 and all of the unrest and all of the changes that people around the country and around the world even have had to go through right now, we are in a phase of change. We're in a phase of loss. Many people are losing their lives, losing their loved ones, losing their jobs, losing their identities, losing the people that we thought ourselves to be. So what can we do? Lessons from a lobster. Remember that endings are necessary. That's the first thing. Remember that endings are necessary. You'll spend much of your life, like the lobster does, either in the process of or preparing for transition. So remember that this is necessary. Acknowledge that it's happening. Look for the new shell that is developing underneath your old shell. Recognize that that new shell is developing. Don't deny it. Take care of yourself. Be sensitive to your own needs. Don't be afraid to hide in your cave in order to restore your strength and to protect yourself. Find familiar things that can sustain you. If that is an old hobby that you had forgotten that you enjoyed, this might be a good time to pick it back up. The lobster would say, eat your own shell, your old shell. Consume the nutrients that will that from the situation that is ending. Learn everything you can about yourself in this time. Take a look at all the ways that whatever is ending has worked and has sustained you. Why did it sustain you? Learn everything you can from the old shell. Don't let it go to waste. And finally, find someone to talk to. Just prior to molting, if you'll remember from the lobster, just prior to molting, the lobster will absorb a lot of water, which causes the new shell to swell and push out the old shell. When you're ready to make your move, find someone that you trust, a friend, a life coach, a therapist. Find someone you trust. Surround yourself with that water, with that support. Find the help that you need to climb out of your old shell. Thank you.